Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. In November, 10 states voted on abortion access in the November elections. 7 of those states passed the ballot measures that would expand reproductive health access. But of course, that was just the start of implementing the legislation. And in some states, things remain in limbo. Joining us now to discuss the state of reproductive rights in America as we head into 2025 is Lauren Peterson. She is the co-founder of Abortion in America, a storytelling initiative around reproductive health access, and she's also an advisor to Charlie, a chatbot that helps people access the medical care they need. Lauren, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
So abortion, reproductive rights in America, really broad topic, but I want to start by asking you, at this point in December, what are you most focused on? Who are you hearing from at Abortion in America at this point in time?
At Abortion in America, we are focused on really the same thing we've been focused on since we launched in October, which is lifting up personal stories around the impact of abortion bans. We believe that these stories are powerful. They have the potential to change hearts and minds, shape legislation, but they aren't reaching enough people. So we are focused on trying to get these stories in front of as many people as possible. In terms of what we're hearing, we have been in touch with hundreds of not only women who are denied care, their family members, people who had to travel out of state to receive care that should have been available in their communities, but also doctors, medical students, faith leaders, a really broad swath of folks who have been so eager to share their stories and their perspective on these issues. And the day after the election, one of my co-founders, Cecile Richards, and I started calling around to some of the people who had been most active in sharing their stories around the election through ballot initiatives, the presidential campaign, and other efforts. And we were really worried that what we would hear was that people were worried that their stories hadn't made a difference, or they felt like they had taken on this great personal risk. And in some cases, ultimately, we lost those fights. And we thought we would have to kind of pick people up off the floor. But what we heard was, I want to keep telling my story. I'm more passionate than ever. I want to do even more. So, in some ways, it's been infuriating. And in other ways, it's been really inspiring and encouraging and galvanizing. I think people are as committed to this work and as engaged as they were the day before the election.
Obviously, we have a patchwork of different state laws, and you are not a legal expert, but I'm wondering, are you hearing from women in certain states more than others at this point in time? I'm thinking of Missouri, for instance, which is one of those states that had an abortion ballot measure in November. It passed, but there's been a holdup as there's been some other legal challenges that really, I think, put the entire measure into question.
What we're seeing in Missouri, I think, really shows that you can never take either a victory or a loss on the issue of abortion access for granted. These are fights that we have to continue to fight all the way through, not only passing these ballot measures, but as the laws are implemented to make sure, there are ways to implement them so that they more strongly protect all forms of abortion access. There are ways for these ballot initiatives to be weakened in the process of implementation. And what that really underscores for us at Abortion in America is that right now, as lawmakers are making important decisions about how to implement these laws in places where we had wins, and in states with bans where we're looking at what is the legislative strategy to push back against these bans, the voices of people personally impacted by abortion bans need to be front and center in these conversations. They cannot go away because campaigns and ballot initiative public fights were won or lost on election day. We have to keep this work up, and we have to make sure that these stories are still part of the public dialogue and the public consciousness. In terms of states where we're hearing from people, it has been really nationwide. We hear from people in states where there are abortion bans, of course, and particularly in the states where we've already begun storytelling work like Louisiana and Florida. But we also hear from people in states where abortion is legal and accessible who say, it's not right that I can access this care in my community, but other people can't. I want to share my story. I want to talk about that. Or even people who say, it was just a little bit harder than it should have been for me to figure out how to get support to cover my abortion or to know what kind of procedure I wanted. And we're interested in lifting up all of those stories as well.
How do you think the stories that Abortion in America have already told have moved policies across the US? Is there a direct line you can tie, or anecdotes you've heard from lawmakers who's perhaps heard of someone who was having a miscarriage and had trouble accessing the healthcare she needed and then maybe reversed their position on the law in their state?
With all humility, Abortion in America launched publicly in October of this year. So we are really committed to understanding the research that can help us show the impact of the stories that we are sharing. That's going to be a big focus of ours in 2025. But in terms of the impact of these stories more generally, or the stories of people who we've worked with, I think one of the most powerful examples is Nancy Davis in Louisiana. She and her partner found out shortly after Roe versus Wade was overturned that their much wanted pregnancy had a fetal anomaly that was incompatible with life. So the baby would not survive. And the condition was called fetal acrania. And in that case, these babies are often developing without a skull or portions of their brain. And there's really it's very tragic. It's news no parent wants to hear. And Nancy should have been able to access abortion in Louisiana under the exceptions. But again, these laws are written by politicians with, in many cases, no medical expertise. And so they are vague and they are written in political terms, not medical terms. So as she and her partner struggled to navigate Louisiana's new abortion ban, they could not find a doctor who would provide this procedure for them because it was unclear whether or not they actually qualified for an exception. So ultimately, Nancy was able to get the support from an amazing organization called the Bridget Alliance, among others. She came here to New York City. She received an abortion at Planned Parenthood in New York. She was incredibly grateful, and so was her partner, for the care that she received and the way she was treated here. But she was so fired up after this experience, and she wanted to make sure that nobody else would have to go through what she went through. So she started speaking out. She started holding and organizing rallies at the Capitol in Baton Rouge. She just she was not going to go quietly into the night here. She had a story to share and she wanted to share it. Because of this, there's still a lot of important work to do. Louisiana is still a state with one of the harshest abortion bans in the country. But thanks to Nancy, the specific condition that she was diagnosed with, that her fetus was diagnosed with, has been added to the list of exceptions. So that's a small example, but think how impactful that is for someone else who now gets that same diagnosis, who doesn't have to jump through all of the hurdles Nancy went through, who doesn't have to travel out of state, away from their community, away from their family to get care that should have been accessible to them where they live. So that's one example, but there are many.
I think that's a powerful example because we often talk about big problems needing big solutions, but sometimes the way you solve something in the private sector or the public sector is one little step at a time. And speaking of one little step at a time, we are literally in the middle of a presidential transition right now. 2025 seems like it carries a lot of unknowns. What are you looking for and strategizing for in 2025, which is not a big election year, so garnering attention could be a little more difficult than it was this year?
Abortion in America is a 501(c)(3), so we're not a political organization. So I want to acknowledge the work of folks who are doing advocacy work and really pushing still for big change and progress anywhere and everywhere we can possibly achieve it, and lobbying lawmakers and doing work that is also really essential. What we're focused on at Abortion in America, again, is continuing to make sure that the stories of people who are personally affected by abortion bans are front and center in conversations about reproductive health. We want to make sure that whether it's lawmakers or constituents or anyone living in this country, no one is saying, we actually think these abortion bans are working really well and advancing public health and safety, because we know that's not the case. We are really laser focused on making sure people know that abortion bans have an incredibly detrimental impact on maternal health, access to pregnancy care and prenatal care. My friend Caitlin Joshua, who is another of our co-founders at Abortion in America, has shared her story of being denied an abortion, being denied miscarriage treatment in Louisiana. But even before that happened, she picked up the phone to make a doctor's appointment when she learned she was pregnant with a much wanted pregnancy and was told she could not come in for prenatal care until after she was through her first trimester, when the risk of miscarriage was lower because healthcare providers were afraid of prosecution under Louisiana's law. That is a story everyone should know. And that's really our mandate. That's what we're focused on. So as these conversations and important decisions are made at the national level about what policies to pursue, or at the state level around how to implement abortion bans or laws repealing abortion bans, we want to make sure that the voices of these people who have been directly impacted by these laws across the country are heard.
We've seen a decent amount of data about how these abortion bans are affecting general reproductive health access, maternal care, maternal mortality rates. And on the general subject of maternal mortality, I've talked to founders who say that telehealth can be a real solution in terms of giving access to doula care. So on the telehealth note, I do want to ask a little bit about Charlie, the chatbot. You are an advisor to the company, and we've spoken to other entrepreneurial endeavors that give people access to contraceptive care who've seen, let's just say, an increase in interest and inquiry in the weeks after the election. What have you been seeing at Charlie? Has there been increased activity since November 5th?
Absolutely. I think at Charlie, folks are seeing the same thing that healthcare providers working in reproductive health across the country are seeing, which is that access to reproductive health care, contraception, abortion is front of mind for people since the election. Because really, one of the big changes we've seen, and I've been working in communications on reproductive health for a while now, one of the big changes is that Americans are increasingly not seeing access to abortion and contraception as a political issue, but as an important matter of health and safety that affects their access to healthcare, their family members' access to healthcare. This has really jumped from the political realm to the personal realm in a very real way. And that's in large part because of personal stories around the impact of abortion bans. So, one of the important things that we're seeing beyond the fact that there is an enormous appetite for information and stories about access to reproductive health care is that there is very little awareness of what care is actually accessible where folks live, which is not surprising because, in many ways, it's deliberately difficult, thanks to abortion bans and restrictions from even before Roe was overturned. It's very difficult to know what is legal where you live, how much will it cost to get an abortion, if I have to travel out of state, what are my options? And one of the most important resources, especially since Roe was overturned, is access to abortion pills via telemedicine, which means you can have an appointment with the doctor remotely. They can prescribe you, or a clinician remotely. They can prescribe you abortion pills. You can receive those pills in the mail. You can take them at home. And importantly, as you're going through your abortion at home, your medication abortion, there are also a number of resources available. The M&A hotline is a great one where medical experts can talk you through what you're experiencing anonymously or answer any questions you might have, address any concerns. This is a really essential resource, especially in states with abortion bans and really harsh restrictions. And such a tiny population, such a tiny percentage of the population knows about this. So, one of the things Charlie is really focused on, the main goal of Charlie, is helping people understand what their options are in a conversational, secure, confidential, and personalized way. Because even for people like me who have been paying very close attention to these issues for quite some time, it's tough to know what website should you go to? Where should you start the process of figuring out how to get the care you need? Charlie really exists to streamline all of the options that are out there and help people parse this really difficult to navigate landscape of options and access to care. The tagline that we like to use is Charlie chats like a friend and answers like an expert.
That's a good tagline. It's interesting as you talk about abortion in America and you talk about Charlie, it sounds like conversation is the through line there. The ability for storytelling and conversation to not just relay information, but to perhaps change policy. And as a journalist, I appreciate that message. So, Lauren, I want to know, what is the number one conversation you want to see people having in 2025 when it comes to reproductive health access?
Oh, that's such a good question. Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit because there are really two. One conversation that I really want to see people having is a conversation about the importance of access to abortion pills online, pills by mail. Again, this is such an important resource. And what we're seeing both through our research at Charlie and through the conversations we've been having at Abortion in America is that there really is this glaring information gap, particularly in moments when people are most desperate to get the care they need. You're not sort of in those moments thinking back on everything you ever heard or read about abortion and remembering, I saw this resource once in an ad on Instagram. You just need a place to start and you need someone who will guide you through the process and make sure you know what all of your options are, and the fact that even if you're in a state with an abortion ban, you still have options. You always have options for care. So, one of the most important conversations, I think, is the conversation around abortion pills by mail. The other conversation that I'm really excited about, and something that we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm for through Abortion in America, is the conversation around the role of men and men's voices in abortion access and reproductive health. Some of our most compelling storytellers who we've worked with through Abortion in America have been men. We've had at our launch event in New York City, we had this incredible panel of storytellers, and I know you were there, and they were all just phenomenally inspiring and moving and really shared personal stories that I believe transcended politics on this issue. One of the people who we've heard about most from folks who are there is a man named Ryan Hamilton, who is a radio host from Texas, who shared at our event and has shared elsewhere publicly the story of helping his wife access miscarriage treatment in Texas and ultimately finding her unconscious and bleeding on their bathroom floor because she had not been able to get the care she needed at a hospital in their community. And the way Ryan is able to share this story is really different from anything I think we've heard before in the conversation around reproductive freedom and abortion access. And what we're seeing is that we did some initial research when we were preparing to launch Abortion in America, and we asked people basically, do you want to know more about abortion? Do you want to hear more personal stories? And there's, first of all, a huge audience for this content. But interestingly, more men than women said they were really interested in learning more about this issue and hearing these stories. So I think what we're seeing is that men are eager to add their voices to this conversation. They're participating in new ways. We also had one of my favorite interviews we did as part of our Abortion in America work in Louisiana was two Baptist preachers who talked about the way their wives had shaped their views on this issue and why it's so important to them to preach from the pulpit about everyone's freedom to make their own decisions. So men are increasingly participating in this conversation as spokespeople and storytellers, as well as people who are eager to learn more and who are frankly changing the way they think and talk about the issue of abortion. So the conversation around men and reproductive freedom is something I'm really excited about in 2025. I think we'll hear a lot more about it.
Those testimonies are so important in the same way that we talk about the importance of parental leave being beneficial to all genders. It opens up a conversation that I think is really important, really across all of healthcare. And this is another big question, but I'm curious, as you talk about incorporating more men into the reproductive health conversation, I wonder, do you think in our lifetime, reproductive health will ever be seen as more of a neutral health event in the same way that we talk about heart attacks and cancer? Or will it forever be as politicized as it is right now?
Yes, I absolutely think that in our lifetime, we will get to a point where access to reproductive health care is seen as a neutral health topic like any other. And the reasons why I think that are, first of all, it has not always been a politicized issue. I worked at Planned Parenthood for years, and one of the things Cecile Richards, who was then the president of Planned Parenthood, often talked about is the fact that in many states, including her home state of Texas, some of Planned Parenthood's founders were Republicans. It was not so long ago that Democrats and Republicans could find common ground on this issue. So there's precedent. We've been there before, and I think we will be there again in large part because of the transition that we're seeing among the American people. They increasingly see across political identities, across party lines, the American people increasingly see access to abortion not as a political topic, but as an important issue of healthcare. And they're increasingly aware of the ways in which abortion bans affect pregnancy care, prenatal care, all facets of women's health and the care that people need to raise healthy families. And I think there's also increasingly an understanding that access to abortion and reproductive health is an economic issue. So, more and more, I think the people who see abortion as a political issue are politicians, and they're increasingly out of step with the American people on this. 8 in 10 Americans support access to abortion and oppose a national abortion ban. And one of the other statistics that I just really love, because I think it really speaks to the power of these personal stories around abortion, is that among independent voters, 74% who have heard stories about pregnant women dying or almost dying because of abortion bans believe that Republicans' views on abortion, their strong opposition to abortion, are too extreme, compared to 29% of the same group of independents who have not heard these stories. So I think this shift that we're seeing is because more and more people are speaking out. People who have been denied care or experienced complications, people who have lost family members to abortion bans, who have been incredibly brave in sharing their stories with reporters, healthcare providers, community leaders, clergy members. As more and more people are speaking out and coming forward and sharing their stories, not only publicly, but also in their own lives and in conversation, it's fundamentally transforming the way Americans view this issue. And I think that is what will ultimately lead us to the day when you can walk into your healthcare provider's office and talk about abortion the way you would talk about getting your flu shot. Although I realize that has its own political connotations these days. But you should be able to walk into your doctor's office and talk about abortion the way you would talk about checking your blood pressure. And I do think we'll get there.
Lauren Peterson, co-founder of Abortion in America, thank you so much for your time today. We will have to have you back in 2025 to talk about the work that is ongoing, but for the time being, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me and thanks for covering this issue.